Good day, thanks for tuning in. I'm Kody with Up To Kode. Today we're at my folks' place and we're gonna build them a deck. We're gonna go through deck ledger, preparation, drip caps, making sure you have watershed, and more of the structural component, giving you some tips and ideas on how to build it square, level, how to set your beam. We're gonna run through drop beams, flush beams, and just go through a bunch of tips. There's gonna be jam-packed full of information, and whatever information we don't have in this, we'll link to other videos along the way. Stairs is an example. I don't know how much of actual deck planking we'll get to do, but I think once the structure's there, the decking is pretty easy. But lots of information here, so stay tuned. Okay, so this situation that we have here is a little bit different, but it's the proper way to do it. We do have another video on how we actually did the preparation here. This is an EFA stucco system. The drip caps are relatively the same in conventional methods, and I'll draw you some photos and details there. But probably the biggest thing is making sure you have a lower drip cap here, if you're starting from fresh or if you have the ability. That way, you're just trying to prevent water from trickling here and then just running underneath, and then it basically will just soak into the house. So what'll happen here is it'll still trickle in, but when this is angled at a 60-degree angle downward, and then it'll run back out and it'll drip and break and fall away. That's the whole point of a drip cap. What we did here, this is actually 2-ply ledger because we have 3 inch of foam on the house. And the first ply that's up against the house, I actually made curve cuts. So I took my skill saw, 1/8 deep, maybe 3/16, and I just made a bunch of vertical cuts in that. And that's something that we're gonna start doing on all our decks. Because what happens is if you get complacent in the wintertime, the snow builds up, and when it thaws and freezes, what happens is the water will just sit here and it'll just saturate whatever's there. But if you have your proper building paper, which I'll show you here in a minute, you have it in behind there, and if you do those vertical curve cuts, it allows the water to run down, and if you watershed everything properly, it'll run out of this drip cap, you see? So it's a perfect system. And then we have this top one. We've designed this so our deck boards will fit in between. And then same thing, any water up here, if it runs in, it just drips off and either onto your deck and outward. But at the end of the day, you just want to protect your house. Deck ledgers, I think, are probably one of the biggest things that are failed on a house. Because everyone's like, oh, it's a detail that everyone forgets. They just slap on the ledger and they don't think about how to protect it when water's sitting there and basically capillary action and saturation in behind. Keep that in mind. But I'll show you some diagrams. All right, so I do this diagram a lot for my guys on site. Let's say this is your wall. Here's your plywood, whatever. Here's a stud and maybe your basement concrete. So I'll do a few different colors for you. You want to put your deck ledger on. If you're starting from fresh, what I tell my guys is I just run a piece of Tyvek or tar paper, depending if you're doing stucco or what you're doing. I just put a piece of paper there. Then I put this bottom drip cap on, like that. Then, this is what I like to do on conventional methods, is I like to do a piece of peel and stick. Oh, I have to extend some of my lines here, sorry. So your paper runs up. The blue one's the peel and stick. Then you put your deck ledger on. There's the deck ledger. And then you calculate this out. Oh man. That's why it's good to think ahead, my friends. Oh yeah. Then you put your other drip cap on. Obviously there's no gaps in real life because we're pro, right? All of us. Or you're gonna be pro after watching my videos. So then with that, you have protection in behind. The blue one's your peel and stick. The red one is your building paper. Then later, if you're doing parging or something, you can tuck other paper underneath this and shingle effect it. This is all shingle effect. And then later, when you do the rest of the building, your building paper can run on top of here and everything's lapped. So water gets in here, runs out. Water tries to do the capillary in here. We've curve cut the back of our rim joist and it has peel and stick for extra protection, and it runs down and out of that drip cap. So that's how you prepare for that. I think that's got enough info there. Let's get into building the deck. All right, so we're gonna run through what a drop beam is versus what a flush beam is. Just more of an architectural difference. So let's say that's your ledger on the wall. I'll try to draw it a bit bigger, overemphasize it. Then you have your joists. There's your joist. Now what a drop beam does is it sits below. So it's dropped. So whether you have 2 plies or 3 plies, depending on the engineering. Then you have your post, and whether it sits on blocks or a piling or whatever, right? So that's a drop beam. So what you're allowed to get away with is you can actually do like a 24-inch cantilever. Sorry, bad writing. You can do a 2-foot cantilever here. So you can keep that in mind. So you can go a little bit bigger deck and a bigger span on a smaller joist, because you're loading your actual span is from end of bearing to end of bearing. So this is your span, and because this is a cantilever, when this weight is on here, it actually helps push the middle back up. So rather than it just sagging down the middle, the cantilever actually helps kind of counterbalance it a little bit. So that's one way. That's kind of the most common way. Today we're going to do a flush beam. Just my brother Rudy figured he liked the look of it better. There's only really one drawback in this situation. I guess if you want the bigger spans, that's a drawback too. But we're going 2x10s anyway. So there's our ledger. So a flush beam is just, you actually build your beam at the end. You have your post, and then obviously you need more joist hangers. You need a joist hanger here and a joist hanger here. And then it's all just nice and perpendicular or parallel. It's just flush. It's a nice clean look. The only drawback today is we're actually gonna set this on concrete blocks, which is a faux pas in my mind, but we'll go through that in a little bit. So this concrete block might actually end sticking out past the front of the deck, but decision's been made already. We're just gonna do it. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna pre-build our beam. So what we're gonna do, basically we gotta get the length of this whole entire ledger, and we'll build our beam the exact same length. But in the previous clip, I did lie to you. We're actually doing 2x8 joists. I don't know how my brother talked me into it, but so I have a 2x10 ledger here. It's gonna be a little goofy, but we're doing a 2x10 perimeter. So I'll show you how that's gonna look. So that just adds a little bit of complexity, because if I was keeping it all the same, I would just measure the total length of my ledger, make my beam the exact same, and then we'll show you. Then from there you can start squaring and leveling and getting your heights. So today what we're gonna do is I'm just gonna measure 1.5 inches. I'm gonna do that on each end. So this is a 2x10. Now if you put your ledger on level, then you should be able to just use squares for everything. So now I'm gonna do the same thing on the other end, and my beam is actually gonna be 3 inches shorter. I'm gonna measure from here to the inside of the other 2x10. We're gonna build everything to this line, and then later we're just gonna cap the outside with 2x10. Now, if you notice, I like using PWF treated underneath my joists, my rim, because this is below grade or underground rated treated, and you can see the perforations. It's not the super nice outdoor wood. And that's probably why he talked me into this, is because we can do PWF for everything, the structure work, and then the 2x10s that we cap the outside will be the outdoor wood, so it'll look nice. So that'll actually work pretty nice. Okay, so I'm gonna get Brother Rude here. He's sitting on his behind. Come on, Rural!
He's talking bees.
He's the bee's knees. Rudy used to, when we first started Up To Kode, me and Rude were building all the decks together, so this brings back some good memories, eh, Rudel?
Not really.
Now, if you're doing this by yourself, you can just set a nail here and pull the tape. And we could probably, but I'll get Rudel Noodle to hold the tape for me.
I think I have a 30 foot. Do you have one?
No, I'll show him how to do this. Since my math ain't too good, I'll just pull out 20 feet. Hold it tight. Oh. So that's 20 feet. So we're 28 foot. This will drive you guys in the US mad, or not the US, in UK. All you metric folk are gonna hate us. 28 foot 8, and I'm just gonna say 3/4. It's a hair less. 28, 8, 3/4. That's the length of my beam. Here's what the beam's gonna look like when you're looking directly at the house. So I'm just gonna keep it really simple. I'm gonna split it in half, 14 foot 4 3/8. Like that metric, dudes? Love it. Okay, we're gonna do 5 posts. And like I said, we're just gonna split this post on the seam there. Then when we do the 2x10 later, you can overlap this joint if you want to get fancy, which we might as well. So we're gonna get started on that. But another thing, before we get too far ahead, what I wanna show you, another thing I would like to keep in mind is I want to try to calculate my deck length so that my deck boards will work. And I'll show you how to do that. But what I got to keep in mind is, because I need my joist length, I need to know what that is. But I also have to keep in mind that I'm adding a 2x10 to the outside for the nice little cap. And then I should, when I do the last deck board, because of stairs, I usually like a 1-inch nosing. If I do that around the whole perimeter, then I have a nosing so that I can always just put stairs up, and I always have that, right? You always need a nosing, or it should be recommended. So me and Rudy are gonna get going on the beam, but the next thing after that is getting this calculated so that you don't end up with just a little 1-inch chunk at the end, and it's so frustrating. It's like, oh, I just got this little chunk of deck board that's teeter-tottering and it's up under my drip cap and I can't screw it. So we want, under this drip cap, we're gonna try to aim for a full-size piece. So mathematics is fun. I also forgot to mention, if you're doing a beam such as this, you are allowed to cantilever the beam from your post up to 18 inches. So just keep that in mind, but you can't go more than 18. And your joists on a drop beam scenario can cantilever past the beam 24. But the reason this is only 18 is because a beam takes more load, so you can't have as much cantilever there. But anyway, we're gonna get going on this. Then I need to figure out my spacing for my posts. And like I said, we need to figure out our joist lengths. But till then, we're gonna build for a little bit. We also wanna crown all our material. So what crown means, if you stay there, you have 2 parallel edges to a board. The board's either gonna go like this, or it's gonna go like that. And crown up, so you want it to always hump up, so it kind of fights up against gravity, or however you want to say it. So this one, if you look carefully, and I always just look down the edges, crown up is on this side. So we always want to mark them. You always want to mark them, because when you're cutting and flipping and turning, oh, see, Rudy already marked it. See, he's a good little pup. He remembers. Now, I wonder if he remembers this. We used to go crazy when we first started. We miter saw everything, and now we just skill saw it. If you're any decent, you could do it with a skilly. Your deck boards you might want to do with a miter saw, but the structural work doesn't need to be as fancy. And then if you're on a budget, or if you don't own a miter saw, you can do it all with fairly inexpensive hand tools, or you don't need the full array of artillery. One thing I always like to make sure that the factory ends are square and they're not too chipped. The other end I've already analyzed and looked at quick. The other end I want to cut off. This end's pretty decent. It's not perfect, but so I'm just going to go 14'4" and 3/8. And if you noticed, I made that little tick. That's where the waist side is. So when I make this mark, I'm going to cut the pencil line off, and my skill saw blade sits on this side. And if you notice here, this end's kind of garbled. That end gets gone. Rude's going to cut that. We gotta make sure we crown these the right way. Because of all our little trips around our funky setup here, we would have got confused, so luckily we marked them. So crown the same way, we're gonna flush them up, we're gonna nail these together. But what you also gotta keep in mind is our sawhorses are spread way too far apart. You don't want your beam, if your sawhorses are spread right out, the beam's gonna sag, and then when you nail that together, you're gonna nail a sag into it. So you just gotta be mindful of that. So we're just angling these because these are 3 1/4 and we don't want them gouged and poking out the other side. And if you change directions, you'll never pull this beam apart. So don't screw up.
Get new wood.
Just go up a little bit, Rude. Yep. Go up. Okay, we'll back down. Okay. I'll just set it for straight now, and then I'll fill in between after. And these are galvanized nails. I don't know if you heard us say that. Oh boy, you got a crank on her now, boy. Oh yeah. Okay, pull back. Now that's called the toenail. If you need to push your beam and get it more flush, toenail it, and then you can pound that, but we don't need to pound it because it's flush.
We have someone that manipulates steel and wood.
The manipulator. You scared?
Yep.
Yeah, if I needed to get these more flush, I could beat that with my hammer and it would drive this top one over, but it's flush. I'll apologize right now if I repeat myself. The beams are done. They're 2 plies, but remember we're doing that 3rd ply with the 2x10 later. So I think I mentioned that. Now, what I said earlier is this is kind of a full paw. I don't normally like using these blocks, but sometimes you can't go overkill all the time. Sometimes you want to build something and you want it remotely budget friendly. You have to use something like this. Now, on a deck, the reason we usually like to do a concrete piling or even a screw pile is so the deck doesn't float or sink, you know, because in the winter you have frost that can heave it up, or you can get it to sink or settle into the ground. But in this scenario, we have all the tools, we have the know-how. We want to just do this simply. We're going to set it on these blocks. And worst case scenario, we just either just add in some chunks, or we just change the posts and adjust the heights if it sinks or settles. Problem with these, I've never done them. I've usually just done pilings, but that's overkill. If you're doing a covered deck, you definitely want pilings, right? Because you need to roof load and it has to actually hold and be structural. Now, I will say this now, if you're doing a flush beam like you are today, and you do it on concrete pilings and they're structural, then later, if you want, you can add a covered deck easily, because you can land the post on the corner of your deck, right? If you do a dropped beam and the beam is back and your joists are cantilevered, you can't do a covered deck as easily, because then you're point loading in the wrong spot. So maybe we'll show you that if I think of it when it comes time to it. So now we kind of got a massage in order to get our joists level, we need to, I'll show you as we get there, but since these things we have to dig down and we don't know the length yet, we got to kind of figure out a nice way to do it where we get these placed, we get the beam somewhat set, even if it's just roughly, then we get it exactly square where we want it, and then we're just gonna have to fine tune and muck around. So that's why you're making the video with us, so you can see as we go along how we figured this all out. So now we need to figure out the length of our joists. So what I'm gonna do is, so these are all our deck boards. Now they're not as tight as I'd like them. I'm definitely not gonna count this row because there's a big gap there. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows of deck board. Oh man. Is 39 1/4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 is 39 1/4. Because if you figure them out individually, if you're like a 16th off, you could actually mess up over 20 or 30 boards. Alrighty. So that's 5 9/16. That's 5 5/8. That's 5 1/2. So we're just going to take an average. 39 1/4 for 7. So let's go get our little whiteboard. We're going to use a more friendly color right now. Let's just go through that again. We have a double ledger. We have our joist. We have a 2-ply beam. And we have our 3rd ply, which is going to be a 2x10. Then we want, so we have a drip cap here. We want our deck boards to sit like so. We want a 1-inch overhang for stairs for future for a nosing. We're going to go 26 boards at 5.60 inches each equals, so it's 145.6 inches. So that's from the house to here. So I need to minus 1 inch is 144.6. But I'm just going to round this up to 145 inches. Because that way, if my last deck board goes here and I have a little gap, you won't notice because I have a 3 inches of foam and a 3-inch drip cap here. So 145 is my total length. So I got to take 145 minus 3 inches for here, minus 4.5 for here. 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches. So that gives me my joist length now, because I'm not that bright. It's 137.5. Okay, Rudy? 137.5. So we're gonna cut 4 or 5 of those. And that reminds me of another trick. Let me show you. So here's something to keep in mind. If your deck ledger is nice and straight, I'm gonna eyeball this, make sure it's super straight. And if that's the case, and we're doing a deck setup like we are, we can cut all our joists the exact same. But if you're up against an old Kroner house and the deck ledger is like this, I would recommend you'd almost have to do minimal amount of joists and then string line your beam so it's nice and straight, and then you literally have to individually cut every single joist. Or if you're doing a dropped beam, you just land all your joists, let them overhang the beam, you chalk a line on top of your joists, and then you square down and you just cut all the tails off accordingly. That's if your ledger's crooked. I think ours is pretty straight, and if it is, we're just gonna cut all our joists the exact same. Looks pretty good to me. So we're gonna cut them all at 137.5. But we're just gonna cut 5 for now. We wanna kind of just get this rigged up so we can get it level. And we gotta get our post locations down, and that's the little massage work that we gotta do to get it right. So I've been scratching my head how to get this all figured because these silly posts are buggering me up. But and I wanna show you more ways than one of how to figure out your deck. First off, what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull a string line down the whole building. Now I can't do that by myself because it's brand new stucco. I don't wanna wreck it at all. So I'm gonna get Rudy to help me there. And we're gonna pull a string line all the way down. And then over there, we're gonna mark the string. And then I just need to measure back from my string line point, like 4 7/8. And that's where I want the start of the beam. Once I know where the start of the beam is, then I can figure out where this first block's gonna go. Also, actually, Rude, I'm gonna measure 142. Because we're 145 overall, but I'm 142 to the ledger. And I'm just gonna go rough. So this would be roughly the outside of the deck. Okay. Yeah, so I'm just gonna clean this bit of gravel, and then we'll pull the string line and we'll get this right down to the nitty gritty. So what we're doing right now, we're just gonna make the deck parallel and in line with the end of the house. So what I gotta figure out is just as the string touches the building, and then I wanna get my level so that it's sitting plumb. So this nail will represent the end of the house, and then we're 4 7/8 back to where the beam starts. Let's say 5. Oh, you wanted this flush, didn't you, Rude? Yeah, you said you wanted it flush. Rude, can you move this block around for me? Yeah, you gotta lift it to 4 7/8. It's gotta go
center?
No, to this edge.
Okay.
Hold on. Just come in like an inch. Or you want to kind of gotta lift it end. Oh yeah, that's probably good there. Yeah, so that's 4 7/8. And then we're gonna measure from the building out 140.5 to the outside. Yeah, so good thing I made that drawing. 140.5 to the outside of my beam. Roots, just hold me right at the bottom of that ledger. We're darn close, man. I gotta move that block your way, Rude. Just hold on. Let's try again. That's pretty good for now. We might have to tweak it. Did you guys see me pull that nail out of there? Because I don't know why I did that, but I had to put it back in and find the spot. Okay, so we're darn close. This is the edge of our beam. Rude, you're gonna hold me there. 14'4" 3/8. So we're close here. That is bang on for half. 14, 4 3/8. Okay, and then we're gonna go, bring me that level. We're gonna go 140 1/2. Darn close. Okay, and then Rude, run back there. Fourteen, 4 3/8. Okay, go back here, we'll double check. Remember Dad when he always weighed the animals with that old Kroner scale, and he had that big metal blob on there, and he'd always tap with your finger, and as a kid you're just like, how does he do that? Okay, we're gonna go
From the center, roughly?
Yeah, center roughly, Rude. So, or I guess it's just 14. Roughly center. Okay, that's pretty close there, Roots. So what we're gonna do, we're just gonna set those three. They're very close. We're not gonna worry about the other ones that go in the center of the beams. I think we'll get the beams set and get everything kind of secure, and then we could fit those legs in or those posts in after. So what we're doing right now is we're just gonna tack on a full length or an over length size joist. We're just gonna tack it up flush to the top. Just go up, Rude. Yeah, right there. We're gonna figure out our post height. Now you can use, we have the 6 foot level, but they're expensive. So most likely you're not gonna own one of those. So just smack one of those in. And then Rudes, you get it bang on level. And if not, maybe just slightly downhill. Your eyes downhill. You're downhill 23, hold on. 23 3/16. Got the post in. We'll just verify that this joist is in fact level. And like Rude said, he's got the eye of the tiger, slightly downhill. Either way, we're super close. We're gonna do the middle and the end. We're gonna get our post heights, and then we can set the beams in, and then we can fine tune some things.
Oh no, Neil. Oh, music in the...
We're just gonna set it to the high side. 23 1/8. Okay. How's that look, Rude? Okay, we'll do this last one then. Where are you good, Rude?
Yeah, for Tinder. So really, he just is racing.
Right there? So one thing I want to say is we have a video on vinyl decks. Obviously this has deck boards, but if you're doing a vinyl deck, you want slope so the water runs away. But you also want to make sure, and check out our other video, that the vinyl decking goes up behind your siding, and then the siding goes back over top of the vinyl deck. Otherwise, that's another detail that gets missed, and the water just infiltrates the house. So check it out. So now we're good. We can set this beam, Rude, and just kind of tack it into place, and we got some joists cut. So yeah, we'll take this joist down because it's over length. Because we have some flimsy posts, I'm just gonna put these as backing. So you saw that I was just tweaking the posts. They're all nice and plumb. It's still flimsy until we get the joists on. Now, this is called a concealed hanger. I'm gonna use these on the ends. And that way, because a lot of times you have a hanger and you gotta you don't know what to do because the tabs are outward. So, because my 2x10's sitting here, I'm gonna set this one here, but I need to actually measure my joist and then get this at the right height. After we set these, later I'll show you our trick, and we've learned this over the years. Instead of pre-installing your hangers, we actually pre-install our joists. We just toenail them in place, and then we put the hangers on after. And then that way you can get everything nice and level and flush at the top, because dimensional lumber is always different sizes. This joist is 7 5/16. I'm gonna check the other end. Seven 3/16. So 7 3/16 on this end. So 7. And I'll just mark this other one so I don't forget.
I like to get smashed. Now we call her smash hole.
Definitely want to wear your safety glasses doing this. Yeah, I always used to pre-install my hangers. I don't like doing that anymore. So you gotta have the right width, and you gotta make sure the bottom is square. And if you have a deck of any size, it's probably worth buying one of these, because man, these are handy. So here I gotta get my little head down right level with my pencil mark and hope that this all works out. Oh God, so scary. So we got that concealed hanger on. We have this concealed hanger on. Now, before I get too carried away, I'm actually not gonna put these joists in. I'm gonna do the next one in, because I'm gonna have to shorten this first joist because of the hangers. Then, before I get too far, I gotta actually do a layout. So I think what I'm gonna do, layout is always important. Doesn't matter what you're doing. You just want, we're doing 16-inch centers because our deck boards are only like inch, or they call them 5/4. So technically they should be 1.25 inches, but they're more like 1 inch and 1 inch to 1 1/8. That's why you need 16-inch centers for your joists. Now remember, if we overhang 1 inch with our deck board, we're gonna overhang it from the deck ledger. And then I'm just gonna go We want 16 to the center of our first one. So I just go back 3/4 and I'm gonna go 15 1/4, X on the right. So I'm just gonna square that down. Then I just set my nail. So you notice how when I hook my tape, I'm gonna hook my tape so that it's on my pencil line. So once you move it, once you mark your first one and you move your nail, you never have to do the 15 1/4 again. I'll show you why the layout's important. Rudy's holding me 1 inch overhang, and that's if we want to overhang the deck boards off the ends, because we might actually do stairs off this opposite end. But if you have an 8-inch, you can cut an 8-foot deck board, so you can cut a 16 1/2, it'll land on a joist. It'll land halfway. If you want to cut a 12-foot lands. And if you want to cut a 16, and it doesn't matter, you can, center to center is always the same. So you can cut 4 foot, you can cut 80 inches, 96 inch, anything on the 16-inch center. And that's why your layout's important. So you're not constantly going back and having to measure and be like, oh man, like your layout has to be, once it's set, then it just makes life easier. And that's what I said earlier, layout's always important. Doesn't matter what you're doing, and I was referring to drywall or framing or plywood or decks, anything that has material going on that has a 4 foot or 8 foot or 12 or 16 foot increment. So now when we lay out on the beam, I'll show you what to keep in mind. Now you got to keep in mind, remember at the beginning of the video, our beam is the length from 2x8 to 2x8. So now that I have a layout here, I actually, for my beam, because this location exactly is the end of our beam. So I'm 12 3/4. Now I just hook on the beam, 12 3/4, X to this side. Square that down. I'll set my nail, and then it's just 16, 16, 16, 16 after that. Let's see if this works out. 12 inches, end of beam to that mark. Look at that, Trav, it worked. No edits, it worked. So we know our beams are 8 length. So Rudy and I just landed this center joist. It was the dimension we want. Now it's starting to get secure. We're gonna tag the ends, and then we can triple check our square, and we'll show you 2 or 3 ways to square your deck and make sure. Before we do that, I do want to give you a tip. If this deck was any taller, we'd want to have some bracing on this beam so it's not flapping in the breeze. So this is a turnbuckle. This is the greatest invention, greatest investment we've ever made. These are roughly 18 to 20 bucks. That's Canadian. I don't know what it is in the US or anywhere else on the planet. But these are marvelous. What you can do is you can tag it. Obviously that's not the right angle. You can just screw it to your beam. It has, not that you're gonna have any steel curb pins like this. So the steel pin would go in this center hole here, or like most people, you could just turn it sideways, do a wood stake, and then just use these screws. And then you just turn this and it adjusts. So that way, if you had this up high, or let's say your ledger against your house is really crooked and wavy, you use 5 or 6 of these, you pin it along your beam, but you keep them low enough, you keep them down here somewhere, so you can run a string line, and then you have a string line to gauge your beam from. Just things like that. Just super handy tip there. Got a layer of roodles. This joist is just a tad high, but I want that because I'm toe nailing downward. And as I suck it tight, it goes down. Good to go. Now it should start to make sense why we don't pre-hang the joist hangers. We just tack all our joists, at least 2 screws each. That way if you accidentally step on it, it doesn't fall down. And then this will set it all perfectly. We'll get it all squared up and then we'll put the hangers on, and it's just way faster, way more accurate, because now we can get them all nice and flush to the top. Now this one has less of a gap, so I'll keep it a little closer to flush. So far so good. If you look down the beam, it's pretty darn straight. Next thing we're gonna do, remember how I said our string line, like our deck is set back 4 7/8? We're gonna make a mark 4 7/8. I'm just gonna put that to the end of the beam, and then we're gonna re-pull this string line and we're gonna double check that, and then we're gonna start pulling some square dimensions. So we have the string line tight, and go look at it at the house there and just see. I won't touch it right now. What's it look like? Pretty close. It's really darn close. It is windy. We are going to verify a few other dimensions first and make sure that we're square. So I'm going to show you 2 ways to verify that we're square. One method, so this is the plan view, or the view looking down upon the deck. So our joists are going to go in like this. I've drawn the back deck ledger, and I've left, because we're 1.5 inches long here, and I've shown that just to be specific, because in real life I'll show you how not to mess it up either. There's a couple ways. I'll try to run through this quick because we're going to go through it anyway in real life. But we can do a 3, 4, 5. So it's a 3, any increment of 3, any increment of 4, and this, when it's perfectly square, will be an increment of 5 at these intersections. So that's one way. Or the other way is, if you know that this dimension is, let's say that 145, whatever, it doesn't matter what it is, as long as this dimension is the exact same as this dimension, and from here to here is the same as it is from here to here, then you can just do, you can measure crossways, and each dimension will be the exact same when it's a perfect square. Okay, so we're gonna go through those in real life, and we'll see what's what. So we're doing the 3, 4, 5 method. I'm butting myself into the ledger. Now this theory and this way works if the deck ledger is straight and this joist is straight. Now if you look down, the joist is really good, but you got to keep in mind, if it's a wavy or it's got a bow in it, don't do the 3, 4, 5 because it won't be accurate. But the best way to be accurate is to take it as long as you possibly can. Now I wish we were 12 feet because then my 3, 4, 5 would work perfectly. Let's see here. I'll show you what I mean. So if I times these by, I could go inches, I could go 30 inches, 40 inches, 50 inches. Or what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna times all of these by 3. Times 3, times 3, times 3. So 9, 12, 15. So those are our numbers that we're gonna use. So I'm gonna go 9 this way, 12, and this should be 15. So inside to inside, so 9 feet, I'm gonna mark that accurately right there. And I like to circle it. 9, 12, and then Rudy's gonna hold the corner of my tape measure on the 9-foot mark.
Make sure you're on the right corner too.
Yeah, you gotta make sure you're on the same side of the tape measure. I'm a 1/4 inch too tight, so I'm 1/4 inch less than 15 feet. So what that's telling me is that deck's got to go out just a little bit because we're sitting a little bit too tight, so we got to extend it. So that's the first way. And then let's do the cross dimension and just see how close that is. Because now we have to contemplate, if it's got to go that way, do we push it out and risk being able to look down the side of the building and have it kicked out? Or has to be relatively square, so when you're doing your deck boards, you don't have these weird cuts at the end or any weird where the deck boards don't sit flush the whole way. So when you're squaring, you just want to make sure that you communicate well where you're measuring to so that you don't get confused, because you can go inside inside, outside outside, so it doesn't matter. Now this scenario, we're going to go outside. I'm going to get Rudy to hold me at the 2 right on the ledger because we have a gap here, but hold me right on the ledger, Rude, on that mark, because remember that mark is the outside of our beam. So I'm going to run over here. Now, like I said, I can measure inside to inside, but I'm going to measure to the outside of the beam. You good there, Rude? 31 foot 2.5. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually hold my hand on there just in case I read it funny. Then if I'm totally off, I'll know that my hand hasn't moved. So if something's way off, I'll know right away, or if I read it wrong. Good there, Roodles. So you're hold the 2 on the outside of the beam, the very outside corner, but not on our block, right? Okay, so I'm not going to go to the joist. That hanger got buggered up because I got scared. So I'm going to go to that pencil mark on the ledger. Good there, Rude? Yep. Holy man. I didn't move my hand, like I said. We're maybe a 1/16 of an inch off. So I would say that that's bang on. The 345 was a little bit out, but this cross dimension is more accurate. Like I said, the sides have to be the exact same length, and the beam and the ledger have to be the exact same length, because I've had guys do work for me before, like I've had guys prep garage pads. The diagonal measurement was bang on, but the perimeter dimensions were all over the place. They didn't match. So it doesn't matter if the diagonal matches, but your sides also have to be good to go. So we don't have to change anything now. We're going to lay in all our joists. Everything's going to be set true. We have to pluck these legs in, which that should be pretty easy. We'll just find center in between the already existing legs. And then once we get some of that in place, because we did 2x8s, we're going to do some midway blocking, but I want to show you a few tricks with midway blocking that is fairly critical. Hopefully that makes sense why we set the joists the way we do. We can get them nice and tight, they're secure enough, and then it makes it a lot easier to put these hangers on. Put your eye goggles on. Now I'm going to do a hole that's a little bit away from my finger. And then I just want to pull up on the bottom to make sure I have contact along the whole bottom side of the joist. So now that I'll let Rudy put all the hangers on. I want to do the midway blocking, and then structurally we're done and we're ready for deck boards. What I'm going to do, it's called midway blocking for a reason. I'm just going to go 70 inches. Rudy marked his 70 inches. All right. Good?
Yep.
We have that snapped. So now we're ready to do midway blocking. We chalked our line. The most important thing about midway blocking is while we had a break, Rudy went and cut these on the miter saw. Make sure you have nice square cuts. Because what'll happen is if you make a bunch of crooked cuts, if you can imagine lining up all your midway blocking along this whole thing, and if you do crooked cuts, it'll look like that and like that and like that, and because you want this edge to be nice and true and in line. So if you do lots of cuts that are bang on miter saw or really accurate with the skill saw, then when you install your midway blocking, you screw it, not nail it, because when you screw it, it holds everything tight. Whereas nails, if you jumped on one joist, it could pull it out and it could actually kick that joist down and it would stay there. So with screws, holds everything really tight. Hopefully I made good sense of that. Just make sure your cuts are all nice and square. Now, the actual installation of it. Our first joist base is not gonna be 14.5. Every other joist base should be 14.5 or maybe 14 7/16 depending. So I'm gonna jump out of here and I'm gonna show you what I mean and something to be aware of. So what you want to avoid is when you're doing your midway, every 3 or 4 rows, you want to check to make sure that you're not getting a bulge in all your joists. You want them all straight. So how you do that is you take from a layout. So let's say you get 3 or 4 midway blocks in, you start from your layout point and you say, okay, to the edge of this joist, I want to be 62 3/8. Or this one, I want to be 78 3/8. Whatever that number is, then when you check in the middle, if you're starting to grow, then you cut them to 14 7/16 or 14 3/8, and you just got to check every once in a while. Because guaranteed, if you put, obviously your first starter one's different. Your first starter one, you just measure off of this point, not in the middle, because they're all bowed all the heck. So you start here, that's your starter, basically 11 1/4. You install that, and if you put in 14.5 every single midway and you went to the end, you'd be having to force that last joist way out and they would bulge it. So that's all I'm saying is you want to check to make sure that this dimension over here or the dimension at the ledger matches your layout down the middle when you're installing your midways. And if you have them cut nice and square and true and they're screwed, it'll keep that deck nice and straight. And what happens is because the reason you want your midway blocks is so that when your joists are sitting there, when someone puts weight on them, the bottoms are going to rattle. And if there's too much weight, they could spread apart. And that's how you get saggy or loose or bouncy. So by doing those blocks, it'll solidify the deck right up. So now I got some blocks in to show you and to make sense of what I was saying before this. Is because these are all cut square, all of these joints are nice and tight, which therefore this will be nice and flat and on the same plane. If they were cut crooked and you screwed them, you'd start having gaps top and bottom, and then your joists could actually be creating more of like a wave pool, you know what I mean? So doing it my method is the best and for the straightest and easiest install. I've staggered them back and forth just to make it easier to screw. And now, if you watch, it'll still have a little side to side action, but there's no bounce. But if I go over, it's just a lot, I can tell how bouncy it is versus that. That concludes the video for today. I think I've given you guys a lot of jammed information. I'm sorry that if I sped through it pretty quick. There is lots of tips in there. If you want more info or want other videos made, just let me know. Shoot me a DM or just a comment in the video. But at the end of it all, our deck is nice and square. If you look down our beam, it is nice and straight. And if you just look across the whole deck, it's all nice and level. There's no waves up and down. Everything looks really good. We're gonna cap this with that outdoor wood, that nice 2x10 after it's all done. And then I'm just gonna let Rudy do all the deck boards so that this can get done for mom and dad. Stairs, check out my video on how I did a set of deck stairs, and I'll do some more down the road. But till then, thanks for tuning in.